Today on The Intelligent Asset, a discussion on minimizing the impact of climate change in asset intensive enterprises. I'm joined by Michael Wang. Welcome to The Intelligent Asset, a podcast on digitizing enterprise asset management, developing intelligent interactions, and building systems of intelligence for asset operations. For industry professionals who work in EAM and facilities management across transportation, public sector, utilities, manufacturing, and large enterprises. We want to tie the global challenges we all share to the world of enterprise asset management and how we can all make change for the better, building a more sustainable collective future. And this episode is brought to you by IBM Maximo, Australasia's leading provider of sustainability solutions for asset-intensive enterprises. I'm Sam Williams, one of the hosts of The Intelligent Asset, and today we're joined by Michael Wang, technical specialist for Envizi Sustainability. In part two of talking with Michael Wang from IBM Sustainability, we want to discuss how the weather impacts supply chains and logistics across enterprises in Australia and New Zealand. I guess, Michael, one of the things that's fairly topical in New Zealand, for instance, is the impact of cyclones in recent times and just a phenomenal amount of rainfall. Likewise, in Australia, you typically are experiencing both fire and drought, as well as heavy rainfall in different states. Can you talk to us a little bit about how enterprises are using weather forecasting as a way to improve efficiency in relation to supply chains and logistical supply?
Thanks, Sam, for the question. Yeah, so definitely nowadays with the climate change and the impact of the climate change, so we see weather pattern changes, and also we do start experiencing more extreme weathers in our part of the region, and in fact all over the place, right, in the world. So we see this happening more and more often. And so how do business start to making sense of all this, and to start to plan their mitigation strategy around this changing weather patterns due to the climate change. That's one of the challenges many organizations are facing. And so I think in terms of the supply chain side of there are a lot of challenges associated with the weather, right? So I mean, you take an example of a supermarket case where they source the fruit and vegetable from somewhere, and the weather condition itself, and extreme weather condition especially, can impact the production of those the produce of those items on the shelf in the supermarket, right? So how do we kind of mitigate the risk of being being impacted by the severe weather? So there are quite many things the organization need to think about. The first that probably they need to think about, understand how the weather impact their business, right? So from a supply chain standpoint, for instance, whether is the source of the products, or the during the transportation, and all these things that need to be taken into account. They need to really have a clear view of how the weather impact their business, right, from A to B. And from there, they need to have a data source where they can collect information and probably build some artificial intelligence, into the process, and by building a machine learning model, for example, to come up with the predicted, model to understand the future impact based on the weather forecast, for example, right? So with the understanding of how the weather impact business, and with the learning model behind that, so you would have a better understanding what's the future impact to your business with the weather patterns, and whether it's going to be like the supply chain, or whether it's going to be something else, right? So with that, you can start to planning your activities and your operation around the weather, and around the impact of weather, rather, right? So that's a kind of the three step that I would say are prescribed to the any business, who are interesting to leverage the weather information or leverage the weather insights in their business activity or daily decision makings.
And maybe just flipping it over to an outage prediction side of things. I guess one of the things that we have seen in terms of extreme weather events is that it's causing outages of communications, power supply, an interruption of supply of sort of the key things that keep the wheels of the economy moving. Is it a similar approach in terms of managing or predicting outages and your response to outages?
Yeah, it is actually a very similar use cases, although it's in a totally different industry, right? So we're talking about the utility industry facing many outages in a severe weather situations. And I think we can kind of separate the outages into parts. One is that may not be induced by the weather directly, but the other type of outage are induced by the weather directly, right? So we're when we trying to talking about the leveraging weather insights to to manage business outcomes. We're talking about the weather-induced outages, right? So let's limit that first. And then when you think about the weather-induced outages, the first thing you probably need to do again is my three steps I mentioned earlier. So the utility company need to understand how the weather impact their outages, right? So whether it's the wind strength itself or the heavy rains, what are the parameters driving behind the outages, right? So once you have that understanding, you can start to building models, based on the historical outage data, historical weather data, and build a predicted model to predict your outages into the future, right? So say for example, 2 weeks down the road, based on the weather forecasting, what are the likelihood of the outages in the service territory, right? Which particular part could experience an outage if the severe weather comes, right? Whether it's going to be in the eastern part of the states or the western part of states or the central part. So with that information, the utility companies start to planning their resources accordingly. So and it could potentially allocate or deploy their teams beforehand, before even the weather events happens, right? So the track roads and all these things that could happen even ahead of the game, right? So when you do that, you can make sure you restore the power much quicker and after the events. So that type of things is really useful, it's important to get before you even have the weather events impact the region.
So, Michael, just as far as recovery and potential compounding effects that there can be from multiple extreme weather events, one after the other, what have you seen play out in recent times?
Yeah, I think nowadays we're seeing quite a many compounding events, unfold as the due to the climate change. So and extreme heat could have been followed by or compounded by the wildfire, the bushfire. So that will basically uh, aggravate the situation even worse, right? So that happens quite a lot, recently as we've seen, and the last bushfire events, so we still remember that one, and also we see the recent flooding years ago. So and happened several times during the year. So these type of things are happen more and more, and will just become a norm in the future. So how do we become more resilient into this compounding effect and the compounding risk? So that's one of the challenges we have to face. Yeah.
So, Michael, talk to listeners a little bit about the model that you use to deal with compounding effects and the nature of extreme weather events of one kind or another?
Yeah, I think when you start to understand the risk, of your, say, for example, your assets, what's your risk exposure, you certainly need to understand those hazard, right? So this hazard may not be a single hazard, or are we were talking about here. So that could be a compounding hazard, and we're taking into account, so that's one thing we start with, right? So and then understanding the risk have three faces. So one is that you understand the hazard itself, and the other things you need to understand your exposure, right? So whereabouts your assets, your people, your community, in a part of that hazard. So that's your exposure, right? And then we have to deal with also understand the vulnerability, right? So whether you can withhold such a event, with the infrastructure you have in place, whether your infrastructure is not strong enough to cope, that sort of thing also important. So three areas, we need to understand is the hazard itself, the exposure, and the vulnerability. These three forms the risk kind of understanding there.
Super. Well, that's been most insightful, Michael. Appreciate your time. And for more information on IBM's Maximo Sustainability products and services from Certus Digital, click the links below.
Thanks, Sam.